Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and out here on my bench. As you can see, I've already got one of my worm bins all set to go. It's been a couple weeks since this bin and the bin that it's buddied up with have been fed. 14 days exactly. Let me just share with you a little bit of information that I've got here about these systems. So like I said, it's been 14 days since we fed these two systems. The older of the two systems is the 315 day, that's 45 weeks. System, and the other bin that we're going to feed is coming up on its 300 days in service. The younger bin that we're going to feed next is the system that I've got my so-called original worms in. Those are the worms that I can kind of track back to my original population of worms. And what we've got is the original estimates for how many worms started these systems when they were launched. So in the case of this system, it was an estimated 829 worms that were used to start this system, but, starting populations to me are kind of irrelevant because once the worms are placed into a new environment, assuming they've got plenty of space to feel comfortable in, they start breeding, they start expanding their numbers. So we probably have, well over that in here. And this system here has been fed 28 times. Today's feeding is going to be number 29. And in the case of the younger bin, we're going to be giving it feeding number 23 because it's been fed 22 times up until now. And what I've got here for them is an assortment of things. There's primarily leaves and stems of coral rob. There's some mushroom bits in here. And wrapped within a paper towel is, you see, a little bit of pear peels of some pears. And a couple pieces of paper towel that we can slightly supplement their bedding supply with, because the bedding supply is definitely running a little bit low in here. And it was for that reason I laid down a piece of paper towel last time too, as sort of the foundation onto which we put the feeding. The foods that they got was carrot and strawberry last time. And after 14 days, I suppose I wouldn't be too surprised to see maybe a few strawberry leaves. But the strawberry, the fruit itself, I would have to assume has probably been consumed already. Same goes for the carrot. Carrot peels also go quite quickly. I do see a couple worms hanging out on this feeding zone indicator. It's just a coffee filter. And there were a few worms on the plastic covering as well. I'm just going to fold the plastic covering over on itself to keep the moisture level in there comfortable for the worms. Hopefully the bright lights don't freak them out and cause them to want to slither out from underneath the plastic protection. So now the feeding zone indicator shows where we last fed, and I had dug a trench into here to place that food into. Now the other weird thing we had going on here, so I did mention the paper towel and those food items I added on top of it. Besides those things that were placed in there, those carrot and strawberry bits, we also added some coffee, of which I've got a little bit more now, and we also sprinkled some of my worm chow into the coffee, which we'll do again today. Those are sort of staple items that seem to make their way into almost all my feeding, so they almost seem like a given. The funny thing I'm seeing here is a whole lot of little, I don't know if you can see them. Perhaps if I were to pick one up and put it in my hand, it might be more easily visible. I'm fairly certain that these are millipedes. The way they curl up into almost looks like a little seashell. And I see so many of them. Millipedes are certainly not a problem in your worm bins. They're actually considered as sort of a helper critter, I think. They just help with the breakdown process. It's the centipedes you got to watch out for. If centipedes make their way into your systems, they're fast movers. They're hard to catch if you spot one. You might have to, hustle to snag it. And you'll want to snag it and do away with it because it'll prey on your worms, and you don't want to have those in your worm bins, that's for sure. So all I did here was I kind of went around the outer edge and I collected up some of this stuff that seemed a little bit drier than the rest, thinking that maybe we can submerge this stuff and get it back into action. A little bit more moisture would help with worm traffic, although the plastic covering here was doing a pretty good job keeping almost everything nice and damp out here on the surface. Even the stuff around the edge that I just collected doesn't even seem worthy of giving any special consideration to, so we don't really need to sweat that. But sometimes I do pull drier materials together from the surface, depending on how I'm covering and how thoroughly I'm covering. Sometimes I'll find material out on the surface to be in, somewhat dry condition, making it unlikely to get the worm traffic that it needs to break down. So I want to get it back in the mix by putting it somewhere where it's going to rehydrate and get a little bit busier. So yeah, I was about to say, underneath the paper towel foundation that we had used for the feeding, we had placed also some of what I'm seeing here, the skins of some almonds. And last time we came in here, they were leftovers. We tried to position them near the feeding, and I think even the time prior they were leftovers already. I think they go back 3 feedings at this point, to the point in time when they were added. And I thought they might be a popular item that the worms might gobble up quickly, but it doesn't seem to be the case. I just thought that by positioning it near where all the other foods were going to be, that it might at least incidentally get eaten by the worm traffic being drawn there by the other more scrumptious food items. And now here I'm seeing the leaves of a strawberry. And I believe that some of the strawberries that were placed in here were in pretty good shape. I can't remember if this was the bins that got it. Some of my bins did actually get some strawberries that were in pretty good shape. Possibly here there were, I don't remember for sure. Maybe it was just the leaves. No, I think these might have been the bins that got pretty good sized strawberries. It even seems to me like underneath the leaves there's a section of this leftover here that even has a good bit of the fruit on it still. A little bit surprising. I thought that after 2 weeks we'd find very minimal, if any, leftovers. I mean, I didn't think that they would gobble up all of the paper that I had positioned under the foods. I thought that that might remain as leftovers, possibly, depending on what kind of appetite these little guys have. This is a piece of corn cob. You can kind of tell just from its appearance. I mean, even though I'm finding little shreds of leftover in here, it's not going to dissuade me from giving them a little bit more to eat today. I would say after 2 weeks they deserve it. But I am always kind of curious just to see how the previous feeding is coming along and try to gauge it based on the amount of time that has passed, the type of food that it was, the types of conditions in which we're trying to compost this stuff, the number of worms we're dealing with. And I don't have any sort of a formula or calculation, but somehow I'm sure that my mind is able to put some order to those little bits of random information to help me, in the future, better strategize on how to handle my worm bins. These strawberry leaves will go eventually. It just seems like they nibbled off the majority of the available fruit that was there. However, the leaves just haven't really degraded to that point yet where they can eat that yet, but they will. They certainly will. So there's worms here and there. There's nothing in this last feeding, though, that is kind of remaining as a big hunk of delicious food around which we're going to see any sort of a worm party or worm ball. So I think what we're seeing here is, little bits of worms hanging out here, little bits of worms hanging out there. And I believe that is just the majority of the worms are just down here in the feeding area. We'll check the outskirts of the bin as well, the further reaches of the bin on the outer edges, to see how they're looking. Sometimes I'm actually surprised by how many worms are hanging out in sections of the bin that are not the feeding zone. You would almost think that the feeding zone is where all the worms would want to be because of the supply of food, but sometimes they're elsewhere. Alright, so we've kind of gone through here a number of times, moving material around, checking to see what kind of leftovers we got. We found a little bit of this and that, but certainly not a whole lot. So it almost makes me wonder if we would want to follow suit with what we did last time, is possibly putting down a little piece of paper as sort of the landing pad for the food that we're going to give them. I'm just looking at little scraps of what's probably more of that almond skin. When I saw that first piece that we encountered in the beginning, I thought we'd find a mound of this stuff. And I had tried to keep it together so that we can stumble on it at some point in the future and gauge its progress. But maybe that first little piece that we bumped into in the beginning was sort of an outlier. Maybe it just didn't get the attention that it needed to get broken down. Perhaps the rest of the stuff that's floating around in here does have some greater progress. I think this is just another piece of that. So I got a feeling that that stuff might take a little while now, because I have seen numerous chunks of it that are still pretty much intact. So it might take a little while for them to break it down. So I guess the only reason I wanted to create that little so-called landing pad is because besides the, kitchen scraps that the worms are given on a regular basis, which has sort of a higher nitrogen content to it, the paper product that I'm going to use as that landing pad, in this case this old coffee filter / feeding zone indicator, is mainly carbon. So that mix of carbon and nitrogen is something that the worms depend on. So I just want to try to keep a certain degree of balance in terms of making sure that near the feeding they've got a carbon-rich supply of something, such as this paper or these scraps of paper, that they could turn to if they need it, and then obviously the kitchen scraps that I'm trying to do away with is the more nitrogen-rich food item. So we did find that piece of corn cob, we found some of these banana stems, and then obviously some of those chunks of strawberry, mainly the leaves, but here and there we even found a chunk of strawberry attached to the leaves still. Another banana stem, but the leftovers are minimal in here, so it does seem like a timely feeding for them. So let's proceed with giving them what we've come down here with for them. This is just another little sort of carbon boosted food portion. The peels of some pear. So this is actually a pretty good sized piece of paper towel here. Perhaps even a little bigger than I thought it would be. And I don't think that's a problem. It'll all go eventually. And I just kind of figured, since, food supply in this system is dwindling gradually, as is the bedding supply, I thought all this stuff would be really popular and pretty fast moving stuff that the worms will do away with rather rapidly. So I am sometimes a little surprised to find leftovers, especially after a 2-week interval between feedings. Here we have some of the stems. And let's not forget to include some mushroom for these guys too. It's a pretty nice size feeding here, right? Let's see here. Yeah, I don't want to really try to scale the feedings or the portions based on starting population counts. So, I mean, if you were to use those numbers I showed earlier, you would think that, hey, there's more worms in here and they need more food, but I don't really think that's the case. And there's another piece of this paper towel here, so why don't we use this last piece of paper towel as something to share between both systems. I just kind of cleaned off the coffee machine with this one, so it's covered in coffee. And we'll just rest it right here on top. But before we backfill and cover the feeding zone, we're going to bring in the, first of all, a little bit of this pulverized eggshell as grit onto the food objects. And then more food, but this is just the coffee. I'm going to sprinkle the coffee across the whole top here. And I want to kind of divvy it up to both systems because I'd like to deplete this entire box of coffee. And then the other thing I often do lately with my coffee is I try to dress it up a little bit to make it less of a mundane food item by sprinkling in the worm chow. So that's a pretty substantial feeding, or at least so it seems to me. And I think we left a fair split here so that both systems should get an equal quantity. So we're going to use the exploration of the outer edges of the bin as our method for covering the feeding zone. This to me I think is just a piece of chipped paint off the wall. So I figure I'm going to extract that as long as I see it. I could have been wrong on that. I'm not 100% certain, but if it is, then it doesn't seem like something that the worms would be interested in eating, so why not pull it out before it just becomes little fragments that can't be extracted anymore. So yeah, you saw how many worms were hanging out there on the outskirts, right? No food applied to the outskirts. I'm pretty sure we've been feeding down the middle for some time. So here the worms are just sort of hanging out. In pretty good numbers for that matter. Very nice. Going to try to level off to a certain degree here, but we're also going to start bringing over the material from this side so that we can excavate the opposite end and see how things look in there. Here too. Lots and lots of worms in this system. If you ask me, well beyond that original starting estimate of 829 worms. I would say there's at least twice that in here. Just judging from what I'm seeing here. That's a very loosey-goosey, you know, from the hip sort of estimate. It's pretty tough to tell, even if you have them, you know, completely separated from the material that they're typically inhabiting. If you just have a pile of worms and nothing else, even then it's kind of hard to tell how many worms you're talking about. Sometimes you could weigh them, and then you could use that weight as a way to try to refine your estimate, but even then, unless you're picking them all out one by one and counting them individually, it's almost impossible to tell. So I think that's it for this system. Very nice. Let's get the other bin out here and get them fed. A lot of moisture in here, you know, with the stuff sticking to my glove. It makes me wonder if maybe at some point we might want to try to help these systems start drying off a little bit. The moisture obviously helps the worms remain comfortable and capable of exploring the entire contents of the system. But at some point I would prefer to see the stuff a little bit more flowing and loose. But for now I think this is going to be fine. Let's go get the box with the original worms in it and get them fed. Alright, there we go. The original worms, yeah, I mean I had some issues once upon a time, and it did seem to me like all my red wigglers had perished. One system after the other, crashing and burning. And then I was able to find one little container in which I found just a couple dozen worms, and I was able to sort of limp them back into service. Now, you know, we didn't have a feeding zone indicator there anymore in the other system. We had salvaged the feeding zone indicator to be sort of our feeding platform. And I think we'll do the same here. Feeding zone indicator is just sort of like a fun thing, but certainly not terribly important, especially since I typically feed down the middle in almost all of my systems. I pretty much know where to check to see how the last feeding is holding up. Pretty sure that this is more of the almond peels or skins. I mean, most people will just eat the entire almond, but sometimes all you gotta do is soak the almond and then the peel slips right off. My mom does that, and then she'll even throw them in the oven and get them a little bit toastier than they would be if they were raw. And those are addictive. You can just start munching on those and find yourself unable to stop after a while. You're thinking, all right, gotta stop. You gotta kind of talk yourself out of reaching for another handful. So here again, just little scraps of paper and strawberry top there, and more little scraps of paper. That's So I think it's probably a good idea to give them a little bit more paper down near the feeding area in case they need perhaps a slightly more carbon heavy food item to complement the kitchen scraps that they're getting. Okay. That humming you hear is my phone vibrating. I don't recognize the number, so let them leave a message. So I just have this sort of habit. I mean, a lot of people don't bother upturning their old feeding zones and exploring the leftovers. I've sort of just gotten into the habit. I wonder if it's a habit that I'll be able to wean myself off of someday eventually. As interesting as it is, sometimes it certainly is not necessary. I think the other benefit to doing what I'm doing here, though, is to aerate the material, which you got to admit the worms are doing on their own anyway, just by moving through the stuff, keeping it all kind of loose and fragmented and flowing. But just in case the material, for whatever reason, becomes inhospitable for worm traffic, starts to settle into sort of a muddy, unoccupied block, it gets really clumpy and nasty, that's when things can turn to trouble. And those are the things that I prefer to try to nip in the bud and break apart sooner rather than later, so that they don't become, you know, a dangerous spot in the worm bin. Not to mention the fact that if it does get that way, obviously you're not composting in any of the sections of the bin that have turned into that sort of a weird situation, so you're dropping your efficiency in your worm bins by having that present in the first place. So I'm finding strawberry leaves. I found a few chunks of the paper that had been placed in here along with the food. So there is consistency in these two bins since they've been getting managed together as buddy bins for some time now. So that banana stem was also an object similar to the leftovers we found in the other bin as well. But I'm not seeing a whole lot more here, so I think it's time to drop in their feeding and press on. I'm being a little bit, quicker here with this system than I was with the first system. So in the first of two systems, or the first of multiple systems, I always feel like if I'm doing more or less a copycat maintenance on multiple systems, then I've already seen what I have to see in the first of the multiple systems to gauge where things stand and how I need to handle the check-in. So in the subsequent check-ins, I feel more confident in knowing what I'm in for and sort of just sticking to the game plan of just getting the food in there for them. So let's not forget these leftovers we encountered too, leftover bits of paper, a couple bits of leftover food, but certainly not a whole lot. And then in goes the yummy food items. Here's the nice stem end. I always like the way those things look when they start getting broken down. The worms nibble off all the soft stuff, and then the tougher, more fibrous bits that connect up to the stem tend to stay a little bit longer and create like an interesting little star flower pattern. So let's spread this out, and like we did earlier, we're going to cover up with some of this coffee soaked paper, but before we do, let's not forget to provide them with a little bit of grit, and then in can go the remainder of the coffee I bought down here for them. Nice feeding. Both systems seem like they're coming along really nice. Somehow I think I've made similar comments and observations about this system in the past to say that even though this system's probably like perhaps 2.5 weeks younger than the other system that we just fed, it does almost seem like it's further along in terms of just the overall condition of the castings. Sometimes I wonder if the reason I think that is just because of the presence or absence of these little leaf stems. And I do see them in here still to a certain degree, but they're definitely dwindling, and they're far fewer. And the castings are really nice and crumbly and flowing, which is really nice to see as well. Before we finish off here, let's do the same here, is just to slightly aerate the outskirts of the bin. It does almost seem like the material in this bin is a little bit less damp and sticky than what we saw in the first system. It all feels like it kind of crumbles and flows a little bit more readily. But there's really not a great deal of difference. These systems are extremely similar to one another. Let's see how things look here, and then we'll be finished. Very nice. Very similar in consistency and moisture content. Perhaps a little bit more damp over on this end. I'm only saying that because I do feel like I'm encountering little chunks that feel like they need to be sort of broken up and sort of dislodged from themselves. Every time I feel something like that, it seems to me it's almost like there's a little fragment of bedding or food or something around which all the other material is collecting and clumping to, making me think that whatever that little fragment is on the inside, it's certainly not getting the attention that it needs to be turned into castings. Perhaps that's the reason I feel like I want to break it all apart and see it all flow and crumble. Very nice. Alright, well, we're done here. Another feeding for these relatively mature systems. They're certainly getting up there in age. And I've even thought about possibly designating one of these feedings as the last, and then perhaps giving the worms a chance to just forage through and pick off any leftovers they still have lingering within here. And then at some point in the near future, start getting them geared up for us harvesting their castings and then getting them into some sort of a new place to be. All that effort to keep my clean hand cleaned, right? I guess as long as I could use the tip of my finger or my knuckle to stop the camera, I'm good, and then I'll head to the sink and get myself cleaned up. Before I do that, really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.